latest edition of MEED Live. We have a special edition this week in partnership with GE, and we're going to be looking at the energy mix, sustaining and securing the future. I have two very special guests with me this afternoon. I have Dr. Sasha Parnay, the General Manager for GE Power Steam Systems, on my direct right. And I have Rajit Nanda, the Chief Investment Officer from ACWA Power.
Hello.
Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
So we're going to have an interesting debate, in-depth debate today about the energy mix in the region, the current state of affairs, and what the plans are for the future. And we'll also have a case study on one of the largest projects in the region at the moment that ACWA Power and GE are both working on. So I'd like to remind you at the start, just below the screen, there's a text box for questions. So if you have any questions, please submit. We look forward to receiving these, and I'll put them to either of my guests. So, okay. Welcome, gentlemen. I guess just to get the discussion started, we'll start off with the topic of fuel diversification. And this is one of the big trends we're seeing in the region. Obviously, since the 70s, the region's power market has been dominated by gas and fuel for power generation. And now we're seeing a shift away from this. So, Sasha, maybe just get your view on the energy market at the moment and why governments are looking to diversify.
Yeah. Well, that shift is actually very global. It's not only happening in MENAT, but also all over the world. This diversification is a clear trend. I think it's coming from the fact mainly that energy is so critical to a country and to citizens. We like to charge our iPhone at every minute whenever we need it. That country can't rely on one source of energy any longer. And they see this as a major risk, and they go and try to mitigate that risk by diversifying their source of energy. And so that's the reason why you see countries going away from their traditional source, like we could have seen in Dubai. As usual, Dubai is fixing the trend, and that's why we see Dubai now going solar, going coal. You see UAE going nuclear, away from this traditional gas and oil.
Sure. And
if I could, Andrew and Sasha, add a slightly different perspective on the thought process here in terms of this global trend of fuel diversification, more specifically for Middle East in that context. I think what we are seeing is that the oil-producing countries in Middle East, they have now come to the realization, or they had already a couple of years back come to the realization that they would like to save the oil for number one, more value generating activities, and I think they would also like to preserve the oil for real exports of oil rather than to just burn them for the purpose of producing electricity. I think there is also a very important element that is coming into the picture and coming into the play, which is the whole context of energy security. Energy security now has become very important for many of these, I would say, Middle Eastern and North African countries who now want to put into play a fuel diversification which is actually giving them less and less reliance on, let's say, imported fuel, fossil fuels that they need to bring into their country. They therefore are driving this whole diversification into renewables on the back of the energy security. This is not to say the fact that renewables on its own merits, on its own standalone basis, have now reached grid parity, are now becoming dispatchable, as we have seen in the context of CSP with storage in the recent DIVA bid, which is a baseload, essentially a baseload bid. So all of these factors put together are what I would say accounting for the play into what I would call the current trends of energy diversification.
And from an ACWA Power perspective, I know that ACWA is involved on bidding for all projects with all sorts of fuel, and you've got built up quite a diverse portfolio now.
Yes, we as a company, our business model is predicated on basically we are fuel agnostic and technology indifferent. So we are here to serve the world rather than just to save the world. And from that perspective, we let the governments do the essential planning, and thereafter we respond to their critical needs. Thereafter we respond to their entire procurement philosophy.
Sure. So yeah, we've got quite a...
Yeah, maybe GE is a little bit in a similar position. That's why we find ourselves together with ACWA quite often, actually, on projects. Since the acquisition of Alstom, GE has become also fuel agnostic. We have technologies, for all type of power generation, whether renewables or thermal. It's quite interesting because that gives us a non-biased view on the market, because we can see the trends without being biased to one or the other technology, and that forces us also to better understand the countries, the utilities, their strategic issues in terms of diversification, but also in terms of sustainability. We all hear about COP21. And that gives us the opportunity to respond and provide the best fit, for each country.
Sure. Well, we'll come back to renewables a bit later. I guess carrying on the themes of diversification, good place to start. ACWA Power and GE working together on one of the largest power projects in the region at the moment, which is the first coal plant. Major coal plant in the GCC in Dubai. Rajat, would you like to tell us a little bit more about the project?
Yeah, the Hassian IPP, as it is called, the Hassian Clean Coal IPP, is a landmark transaction as far as the coal IPP is concerned. I think it was pretty much predicated by DIVA on the back of energy security and energy diversification more than anything else. DIVA, till about 2 years back, had been 100% relying on gas-fired power stations for its energy production. So the coal IPP produces or leads to a very important fuel diversification for DIVA. It's a 2,400 megawatt ultra supercritical power station, which has emission norms that are the most stringent that the world will ever see when this plant goes into operation. The first unit, it comprises of 4 units of 600 megawatts. The first unit goes into commercial operation in 2020, and thereafter every year incremental unit comes into play. The entire construction before the 2,400 megawatts go into operation is 7 years. It's a $3.2 billion overall transaction size, comprising of about 2,550 million US dollars of debt, and the balance in the form of equity and a little bit of early generation revenues. It's a very important transaction, not only in terms of efficiency, not only in terms of energy diversification, but it's also a very important transaction because it does establish in the market the fact that a well-structured and environmental friendly coal transaction can still raise non-recourse debt of significant capacity in today's market, something that most of the procurers, most of the governments believe is not possible. I think the success of this transaction, which is now approximately 10 months into construction, has given a lot of hope and a lot of renewed thinking to many governments and utilities in this region. We are very clearly going to see at least 2 to 3 coal-fired, significant sized ultra-supercritical coal-fired projects in this region in the next 1 to 2 years. FIWA is planning for 1800 megawatt ultra-supercritical coal-fired plant, and it will be pretty much following the lines of what we have seen in ASEAN. Oman, which is a country which has been aiming for fuel diversification in a very big way, has made up its mind to go in for another ultra-supercritical coal-fired project in the region, the first for Oman, but probably the second or the third that we will see in the region, depending upon whether FIWA or the Omani authorities issue the tender first. And I think in a few years from now, we will also see DIVA going out to the market in order to secure incremental capacity on the ASEAN side, which has been prepared for approximately 4,800 megawatts of coal-fired power stations. So 2,400 has come through this first procurement, and the balance 2,400 will get procured in the coming years. The last point in the context of ASEAN, very quickly, is the fact that for the first time we also saw Chinese banks doing true non-recourse project financing, and that too for tenors as long as 25 years, which they have never done in the international markets. To start with, they have hardly done true non-recourse project financing in the international markets. This is the first of its kind, so it was very interesting experience to go through the motion of raising significant debt capacity from the Chinese markets for a transaction which was quite unique.
Sure. Okay, well, we'll come back to the finance a bit later on that, because I know from previous conversations we've had, it was very interesting journey to securing financing there. Sasha, as a thermal power expert, it would be good to get sort of an overview from you on the state of the coal power market, and then a look at the ASEAN project. We have some slides available, so if we look at the first slide here, it talks about the future of coal power generation. So if you could just maybe give an overview of the coal power market at the moment, and then touch on the ASEAN project and whatnot.
Sure. Well, the picture you're seeing is basically very much consistent with the fuel diversification and COP21, let's say, revolutions that are occurring right now. You do not recognize really one technology over another. You really can see a full range of technologies applying equally, depending on each country's specificities. The good thing is that the renewable portion is increasing, so we see that transformation, we see that transition. If you look 5 years ago, it was barely 1/3 of renewable in the power generation. In 5 years, it will be probably 60% or 2/3. So we are in the middle of that transformation. That transformation is not going to occur in one day. It will take time, and that's where coal power generation can be active, supporting that transition phase towards a renewable generation world. And this has an impact actually on the type of technology that is being requested. One, it's actually not coal anymore, but it's actually cleaner coal that is being requested to make it sustainable, and that's the main reason why DIWA has actually taken the courage to go way beyond any type of regulation in terms of environment and make it even cleaner than whatever we have seen before in the world. The technology has to respond to the fuel diversification. So the plant, for example, ASEAN is built to be able to handle a lot of different coals from a lot of different mines. In that specific example, that's Indonesia, that's South Africa, that's Australia, which expands for Dubai the source of energy away from their gas sources. Sure. we see also more and more requirements for coal power generation to participate to the grid stability. Renewables are still intermittent per essence. When sun is not here, when wind is not here, then it stops, and we, our citizens, are not stopping using energy.
Except for CSP with storage.
Except for CSP with storage, yes. It's coming up, and it's good. Storage technologies are also coming up with batteries. But again, it will take time, and of course the renewables are adding instability into the grid. So now the requirements for thermal power are becoming more and more stringent in terms of dynamic support of the grid, and actually DIWA recognized that and requested very stringent grid code support requirements. Okay. So there is a future for cleaner coal power. We see that especially in emerging economies, which basically respond to those three themes. You know, fuel diversification, COP21 cleaner, and also more, let's say, more stable, more supportive on the grid, and not anymore just running baseload.
Yeah, I guess on the international stage, there's obviously been a lot of publicity given to Donald Trump's policy on coal in the US. It's keen for more coal projects to go ahead, but I guess coal is becoming cleaner these days, and the technologies, as you've highlighted, are increasingly making it.
Yeah, what's interesting is that technologies exist. It's not paper technologies. They are demonstrated. They exist. It's just a matter for the countries to have the courage of requesting it. The cost adder is not significant, as demonstrated by the very, let's say, very competitive tariff that this Hassian coal plant could demonstrate. So it's really just a matter of the country to take it on board and request those technologies to be applied. They exist. We can make clean power, coal power cleaner.
Yeah. Sure. And if we just look at the third slide, it has an overview of the Hassian project in Dubai, and it's got some figures here. It'll boost Dubai's grid by 25%. So you're saying that's a lot of capacity coming online at time. 10 percentage points more efficient than the global average for coal. So this is quite a unique project, not just for the region, but
it's actually 10 points. So it's probably in the range of 35% more efficient. So for the same amount of megawatt hour, you basically produce 35% less CO2 in the atmosphere than the ocean of coal power generation that the world has been producing and still be producing today. Sure. So that was also a big push from DIWA and Dubai. It was very important for them to be at the leading edge of these clean coal technologies.
Okay, great. So
if I can just, Andrew, add very quickly just one very incisive point to this whole discussion is, look, Hassian IPP, in terms of its cost competitiveness and in terms of its emission norms, was a big step in terms of establishing for the modern world that coal could be an acceptable fuel in the context of power generation, particularly when the world is moving to decarbonization. Given the fact that the emission norms in the context of this ultra supercritical plant was getting closer and closer to what you would see in terms of the emission norms for gas-fired power station, the gap is narrowing. That's the key message, that if you have the right technology, then you are able to generate electricity using coal as a fuel with emissions that are not as bad as what it used to be 5 years back, 10 years back, 15 years back. The gap is narrowing compared to
some of the emissions. We are actually at the level of gas now.
Yes.
Hassian will be at the level of gas.
Pretty close. Okay. Pretty close to a gas-fired power station.
Sure. And as you mentioned, Rajat, there's a number of projects, other projects coming up. So FIWA, Northern Emirates are looking at a large coal plant, and Oman as well.
Yep.
I mean, Oman have looked at coal about 2009, and then it sort of delayed its plans. So do you think that was due to the project in Dubai, because the tariff achieved? Do you think that's encouraged others to go ahead?
Look, 2008 and 2009, the world was a different place in terms of oil prices. Oman was a different country in terms of its own credit standing and its own view and perspective to the energy mix and the energy security that it wanted for itself. So, look, 8 years, the world has changed. We are in the midst of what I would call energy transformation that is seized the entire world. There is not a single part of the world that is not experiencing this. And in that context, when you put the dynamics of the current economic situation of the world and Oman in particular, its own vision towards how it wants to get the energy mix sorted out, its own fuel diversification policy, its energy security intentions, all of that pulled together, I think going in for a ultra supercritical coal-fired station is a no-brainer.
Yeah. And that's the big difference. You know, back 10 years ago, Oman looked at coal. Today, they look at clean coal. And that's a big difference for them. It was one of the main resistance, you know, for the Omani country and people that you know, they didn't want, you know, just coal technology to be used. But now they're seeing that clean coal technologies are available, and to be frank and fair, they were not available 10 years ago.
Right. So
Then those technologies change the picture as well. You know, it's not just fuel diversification; it's also sustainable and COP21 driven world. And that's what has changed, and I think that's what's making Oman rethink
its plan. Okay, but just before we go on to the financing fast, I had a question here from the audience. With the coal IPP in mind, seemingly pushing coal to stay as a used fuel, where other countries are trying to move away from coal, how long do you, well, sort of touch on this, how long do you foresee coal being used as a fuel around the world before a decision is made to switch over methods or fuels? So I guess we're just talking about a new upcoming project. So,
well, I think decision has been made to switch. We see the switch happening. You know, as I said, you know, 5 years ago it was 1/3 of renewable. Now it's 2/3 of renewable. So the switch is happening, and I think we can be all happy about it, you know, when we see the impact on the environment that power generation can have. But then after that switch, you know, globally, that we see that trend is not going to happen overnight. It will take some time, and also it's very country specific. Each country has a different energy picture around it, a strategic picture around it, and that will make each country decide, you know, its proper fuel mix strategy for the next 20, 30 years to go.
Sure.
One thing is sure is that the trend, you know, is on diversifying and cleaner.
I mean, we'll come to the issue of storage later on for renewables, but that's right, isn't it? At the moment and for the foreseeable future, there'll still need to be baseload power coming from other resources. So
that at least that's what we see in most countries. Yeah. Most countries realize they need to rely on some thermal power that bring this base load to support that transition phase. Yes,
moving forward. Okay, and I guess Raja, just to touch on the financing already. I mean, this was a major project with $3.2 billion total project cost here. How were we able to achieve that financing? I understand there was a mix of Chinese banks and there was sovereign wealth fund involvement as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of the financing mix for ASEAN, almost 80% of the financing came from China, which was primarily the big four Chinese banks, Agriculture Bank of China, China Construction Bank, ICBC and Bank of China. And there was a small participation also by the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which actually took a more important and strategic positioning on the equity side rather than on the on the debt side. But about 80% of the debt primarily came from China, and about 20% came from regional and international banks. So that is how the financing mix stood up eventually for ASEAN.
Okay, yeah, so quite interesting. I mean, I know we've talked before, financing for projects, there's a shift in that, isn't there? With the fall in oil price having an impact on financing for IPPs across the region. So developers such as ACWA, you're now looking at all methods for financing. So I guess that's going to be increased export credit participation and other methods as well.
I think export credit agencies will definitely take an important chunk of the overall financing that will be required for these projects, but there is still a decent amount of liquidity available for many of these countries if these projects are well structured. Saudi Arabia, for example, for greenfield projects would continue not to rely on export credit agencies but just the commercial banks. I think the GENCOs, when they come up in, let's say, 6 to 9 months from now, obviously will find it difficult and struggle to get ECA participation, because the amount of repowering that would be embedded in these GENCOs are still unknown at this stage. But notwithstanding that, I think you will find a lot of international debt capital still available. There is regional liquidity also still available. The procurers are also becoming very smart over the last couple of years, and you see a very interesting phenomena that is becoming the order of the day on financing of many projects these days in power sector, which is the mini perm concept. It's pretty much becoming fashionable for all these procurers to allow the flexibility of mini perms in this financing. And the moment they allow mini perm kind of a concept, soft mini perm kind of a concept in these financings, it opens the floodgates for a number of lending institutions who normally would not be comfortable with very long dated or long maturity senior debt financing, but a mini perm kind of is the sweet spot for them, and therefore the liquidity or the pool of liquidity that is available through mini perm structures significantly improves the availability and translates into obviously competitive tariffs for these procurers. So I think we'll see export credit agencies coming in, but I still think the commercial banks, international and regional, will continue to have a greater proportion of the overall financing that will fuel IPP growth in the region, at least for the next 2-3 years.
Sure. When the oil price dropped, there was a lot of concern about liquidity in banks and things. What we're seeing, though, the liquidity is there. It's just if it's the right project and the right structure, then the banks are still keen to support.
Absolutely. I mean, during 2016 and whatever structuring and whatever little projects have been done in 2017, we have not seen any of these IPPs struggle. Whether it is funding coming from China, clean funding coming from China, international banks, regional banks, all these transactions have ended up being oversubscribed one way or the other. What is pretty interesting is that this year a number of refinancings are expected. Last year we saw a little bit of a trend that was emerging for refinancings. We saw 2 large Saudi electric IPP transactions getting refinanced in 2016. 2017, I think we will see a number of other IPPs getting refinanced, which then gives a lot of credibility to these lending institutions that the capital can be rotated. The capital that they deploy for the construction part of these IPPs gets eventually rotated, and they have an option to exit. Liquidity options are basically being established, and therefore these track records of liquidity options then help to drive the continued interest of these lending institutions and their managements towards these IPP projects.
Sure. Okay, and
maybe if I may, which is an interesting trend also with this refinancing on existing assets. From a technology standpoint, we see also an acceleration of retrofitting and improving those assets. The use of digitalization and digital tools is a revolution also in the power industry. Like each of us has seen a revolution with social media and Facebook. We are in time of a Facebook for industry right now. And the implementation of this digitalization and digital tools, coupled with let's say, installation of new technologies that come up to make those assets cleaner and more efficient and more reliable. The activity around this is accelerating, and I think it would be, and it is actually quite often a nice time when the refinancing is also popping up.
okay.
To take that opportunity and improve those assets. We are seeing this in Turkey, for example, on the coal, because we were speaking about the coal. Relatively old assets, 20, 30 years old assets. Turkey wants to make use of their own coal reserve, and then they push, and those assets are refinanced at the same time, improve the efficiency, enlarge the fuel capability, and decrease emissions also to very low levels.
Yeah, if we just have a look at slide 2 now. It should appear on your screen. If not, there's the tab on the side. We have a slide 2 on digital capabilities and obviously digitization.
Yeah.
Another key trend in the power market just now, looking at some of the figures here, increasing operational efficiency, reducing carbon emissions, maintenance cost reduction. So, digitalizing the power market from the generation right through the grid, that's going to be a key.
It's a key, and it has a huge potential. Just think that one plant produces more data than Facebook in the world. Just one plant. And today, we make use probably of just a couple of % of that data.
Sure.
So just imagine if we start having, digital tools, Internet of Things, able to capture that data and make sense of it, to improve, the operation of the plant. The potential is huge. This slide is just an example of what let's say, potential it could have on an existing old coal-fired power plants that we see all over the world, especially in Europe, US, and China. The potential is enormous to improve emissions, to decrease the fuel cost, and keep the same megawatt for less fuel, or have more megawatt for the same amount of fuel, which from a financing point of view is also very attractive. All those capabilities are there, and I think when you see the speed at which our own life, yours and mine, has changed with those simple, iPhones or tools and social media, and just extrapolate on an industrial plant, the potential is enormous. Yes.
Sure. So, in terms of digitizing the power assets and grids, as you mentioned, it's not just new projects. You can go and retrofit
Yeah,
old
absolutely.
plants as well.
Absolutely. It's really just they're producing data already now. The plant is, there are huge amount of data that we just could not make use of before. But now, with the secured and very powerful cloud technology, you can actually get access to that data at any point of time. And then if you have good technologies and companies who understand the inside of the plant and the machines, then you can start making sense of that data. that's what's happening now, and we see already some of the existing assets in the Middle East investing fully on those digital capabilities. And they start improving their operation already.
Yeah, maybe if I can just add from the ACWA Power perspective or a sponsor perspective. As you know, we are an operator of power stations. We just don't own these assets, but we also operate these assets. So from our perspective, what we are seeing through this wave of digitization, which I call essentially in simple terms as a combination of big data and artificial intelligence. That's what it is. We are able to now graduate towards an era of bringing about huge improvement in the efficiency of the plant, the fleet of plants that we are able to maintain, particularly with the use of what we call predictive maintenance. So this whole digitization, and where you have the champions and leaders like GE out there, are supporting us very much in terms of improving the whole approach towards predictive maintenance, and therefore consequently build it out into more optimized maintenance of the fleet, more optimized maintenance of those power stations.
Yes, what was not possible before for predictive maintenance is a very good example. Is you just look at the trends. Now we have access at all the data. As soon as there is a small deviation on the data, then we can recognize it, understand where this is coming from, and act way before this deviation is increasing and comes to some of the machines breaking. And usually when you do this, you can actually act much more proactively, and then limit the amount of downtime, increase the availability, and decrease the maintenance cost. It's always better to not wait before something breaks and act right away. The cost is much lower as well for the operators.
Yeah, and I guess
prevention is better than cure. That's what Swacha is essentially saying.
But digital gives us that capability now to prevent much better than before.
To do that. And I guess you're talking about retrofitting older plants. Raja, Saudi Arabia is planning to sell off a lot of its existing assets. Some are quite old now to the private sector. I know ACWA Power will be interested in these. So I guess that's the way of improving existing assets.
Oh, that will be a very important play in the entire acquisition opportunities that will come through this Genco privatization. Sure. For sure, the amount of repowering capability, the amount of efficiency improvements that we will be able to bring of the fleet that will be taken over, optimization, rationalization, better predictive maintenance, all of this will support the amount of top dollars that will be put on the table by the acquirers, hopefully to mark the success of all these Genco privatization.
Interesting stuff. Got a few questions here from viewers. This is quite a technical one, I think, for you, Sasha. If combustion is acceptable for duration, where does EFW come into the picture while awaiting regen to come of age?
EFW, I'm not sure what
EFW
that means.
Energy from waste.
Ah, waste, yeah.
WTE or EFW.
Okay, yes, absolutely. Thanks for that. Yes, waste. Waste is actually a very interesting question because, countries like Europe have been making use of municipal waste to produce energy because mainly driven by the fact that Europe doesn't have a lot of space, to just landfill, store waste in landfills, and also they are very concerned environment. So waste to energy was one way of taking care of that waste, and at the same time, producing power. And we see now in the region an emerging waste to energy market.
Sure.
Dubai municipality has run a tender this year for waste-to-energy plants. And if you look at all the countries, a lot of initiatives are actually happening right now. And I think it's a part of the mix, and it will be part of a mix for generation in the near future, definitely. Yes.
Part of the future.
Yes.
Okay, another question. I think it's about reliability of data here. How are vendors made to give accurate reliability figures that will allow better control of OPEX? So I think that question's referring to, you know, when you're running a power plant, maybe for you, Rajat, how important is getting reliable data to ensure that the operating costs are what you've planned for or expect?
Very, very important. It is really the heart of how we work as an operator of power station. It is, well, it is just not about how you operate these plants, but it is also about, goes right back on how you bid for these projects. If you don't get your cost estimates right on the dot, I think it's very likely that you are going to actually have lost out in the competitive bidding, so the project is not yours, or else you have won a project that you cannot sustainably run for the level of let's say returns that you had initially projected it to deliver.
Sure.
Yes.
Either way you are a loser, so therefore it is extremely important that you are really accurate in terms of or you are as close as being accurate in terms of having a good handle on the reliability of those plant performances and the associated numbers.
Yes.
I guess what that relates to what we've touched on, the digital revolutionary system.
It will help in a proactive maintenance. You know, reliability is totally core of any business case for a power plant, for sure, and also ultimately for the utility and the country. You know, they privatize the plant, but they still count on the megawatt on the grid when they need it. Reliability really it's a combination of factors to use reliable technology, you know, that doesn't break every minute, and at the same time experience in operation and maintaining the plants, applying proactive maintenance. So those two elements between the technologist and the O&M contractor, with the digital somehow linking the two together, are the key core elements of getting a good reliability and even improving it over time.
Yeah.
And that's what we see now. Very large improvement in reliability of equipment.
Moving ahead. Yeah, I've got another question here that's coming. One of the eagle-eyed viewers has spotted the magazine on the table here. We recently ran an issue on cybersecurity. So, yeah, I see you have the magazine in front of you. How have the recent cyber attacks bridged the cyber world into power generation, industrial world, been taken account into our projects? And I think they're asking about risk management, insurance, and impact assessment. Is this something that's becoming an increasingly important partner consideration?
Look, I'm not an expert on cybersecurity in the context of power stations, but my colleagues have the responsibility and are pretty active on this. So from whatever little I know, 50,000 feet perspective, all that I can share is over the last several months, cybersecurity in the context of power station has become very important. Our power stations, especially in Saudi Arabia, not that it is not relevant for other power stations that we have in Oman or Dubai and Jordan and so on and so forth, but especially in Saudi Arabia, the regulator is very strongly requiring the regulator and the Ministry of Interior. They are requesting and imposing in certain cases the need for very high quality cybersecurity tools and preventions to be installed on a proactive basis. The whole idea is that in case of a cyber attack, each of these power stations needs to get isolated and go off grid. That is the fundamental hypothesis behind all of this cybersecurity. But then we just spoke about it in the context of digitization. Prevention is always better than cure. So
Sure.
if you are not proactive, and if you have not put in all the right firewalls in order to make sure that the hackers don't get through to damaging or in some ways affecting the security of these power stations, you are in for trouble. So we are implementing a number of proactive measures in this context.
Yes, yes. Power assets were always very strategic. 10 years ago, very high security measures were requested. Just put very big walls and sometimes military protection of power assets. That was part of the construction specification.
Yeah, it is still the case in Saudi Arabia.
For sure, it's,
Yeah.
But now we're moving to the digital world. And we have the same risk, but probably much higher risk in the digital world than in the real world. And I fully agree with Rajit. We see the same happening. Regulators, owners requesting the same level of protection and prevention in the digital world as much as in the real world. And that's why companies like GE, are embarking a lot of cooperation with IT companies to develop platforms, that can act as preventer and protect the plant as much as military and walls were protecting the plant in the physical world.
Previously. Okay, we have another question here. How has conflict in the Middle East, along with changes of governments, affected the power generation market, regionally and globally? I guess maybe make that into a more general question of the political events. What impact do you think that's having? I guess we've touched on the energy security.
Absolutely, spot on.
You touched on that earlier on, that the best way to secure against that is looking at diversifying your fuel mix.
If I can take this one, I think there are two perspectives to it, or at least there are two different contexts that we should briefly touch upon. The first one, you already started the discussion, which was in the context of energy security. So I think some of the ramblings and some of the, let's say, geopolitical disturbances that we have seen affecting this part of the world now makes the case for energy security a more compelling need rather than just a strategic vision. Okay, number one. Number two is the implementation of this energy security is now getting fast forwarded. So that's the second dynamic that is affecting the context of energy security in the specific context of the question that has been raised by our viewer here. The second aspect that we should touch upon is how is this geopolitical uncertainties or the dynamism that we have seen, evolutions and dynamism that we have seen over the last couple of years in this part of the world, how is it affecting the ability to raise capital, both interest of international investors and of lenders, to fuel the infrastructure boom that this part of the world has in general been going through, and more particularly in the context of power sector. Now, if I were to just briefly touch upon this aspect, I would say that yes, the region would have attracted even more competitive cost of capital if we did not have this geopolitical uncertainties. But what definitely remains a fact is that even in the current environment of a bit of geopolitical uncertainty, there is still a lot of capital, both in the form of equity, both in the form of debt, that continues to be attracted to the region, and that will continue at least in the short 2 to 3 years time horizon, fuel the growth of the power sector, the growth of the larger infrastructure sector, particularly under the public-private partnership model. What is fundamentally important is that the region has a demonstrated track record of more than a decade. Now almost 2 decades. If you start with the first IPP that was undertaken in Oman.
2 decades, 20 years.
Yeah, it's pretty much 21, 22 years, a full 2 decades that has come through, and there is a very good track record. None of these investments ever turned sour. The track record of payments from utilities, from the governments, whether it is a AA plus rated entity or whether it is a B plus rated entity, and I'm just not talking of the GCC, I'm talking of the wider Middle East, and including countries like Jordan and others which are part of this overall IPP boom in this part of the world. All of them have a very good track record, and as a result of that, I think we will continue to see continued interest from international capital markets, from international investors, and all I can say at this stage is may long it continue.
Yeah. Well, we have another question here. We're getting plenty of questions from the viewers. How do you see the concession structure and comparative terms in the GCC? Are the termination provisions under these concessions comfortable to developers?
I think if I can take on this one, I think in this part of the world, the termination regime can be dichotomized into 2 buckets. On one bucket, I would place the country of Oman and Bahrain, who have slightly abnormal termination regimes, which are a little bit departure from the classical project finance approach. And then you have the rest of the countries which follow what I call the classical approach, with a little bit of finesse, little bit of adjustments, and a little bit of fine-tuning here and there to adapt to their specific requirements, and so on and so forth. But by and large, these are the 2 buckets. What has happened essentially is that in the first procurement, there was a huge amount of education and convincing that had to be done, and where the developers, along with the procurers, they played a key role in convincing essentially all the stakeholders, the debt stakeholders, to feel comfortable that it will be a regime that will be respected, it will be a regime that, a risk allocation regime that will not see any significant downsides, and these power stations and their lenders and their investors will not be subject to renegotiations and so on and so forth. Over the last decade and a half, the countries of Oman and Bahrain, let's say a decade, and with its first IPP now almost a decade, and Oman almost 2 decades, despite having a risk allocation which is not classical in terms of the termination regimes, they have managed to demonstrate to the lending communities and to the international investors that they respect the basic framework of IPPs, the public-private partnership model. There has never been any payment issues, and whenever there has been issues between these power stations and off-takers, they have all been very constructively and very amicably resolved in the larger interest of the country, in the interest of the fact that these assets are strategic in nature. People have not tried to take undue advantage, parties have not tried to take undue advantage, and as a result this has established a very strong faith in the primary regulation and the boundary conditions under which all these projects get undertaken, both during the development stage and during the construction and operation stage.
Okay, and I have a question here for both of you. Which markets have the most opportunities coming up in the next few years, and what are they? So I guess it'd be good to get both of your perspectives. Start with you, Sasha. In the Middle East and North Africa, which is there any particular markets or sectors or
for power generation, the market is extremely active in dynamic economies, growing economies. So definitely the Middle East and North Africa is one of those regions, growing population, growing industry, and that's making the need for electricity increasing. So it's a market which is very dynamic. In this Middle East North Africa region, we see some countries who are more oil rich and some countries who are who have less access to the oil. That is changing their way of let's say looking at the source of energy they want to tie into.
Sure.
But in general, we see a growth in most of those countries, and some of the countries need electricity more urgent. Some of the countries have a little bit more stability, and they can make some long-term thinking because they have more risk in terms of fuel supply. But there is one trend definitely which is here in the region is it's growing. It's going to multi-fuel and decreasing the environmental footprint. So that's a trend that applies very well in the Middle East and North Africa.
I think from my side, the answer is a no-brainer. I think Saudi Arabia is the single largest opportunity, not only in the Middle East but in the world today for the next 5 years. And I would be happy to defend this statement in front of anyone. 60 gigawatts of Genco privatization, plenty of repowering opportunities, which has not yet been properly quantified in a country that has been growing at the rate of 7% on the power side, 9% per annum, consistently for the last 10-15 years. A population that is significant, and a country where most of its population is young on top of that. I think you look at the demographics, you look at the economics, you look at whatever parameter you may want to. Saudi just stands out compared to each and every opportunity that is on offer right now. Having said that, I mean, the good thing about Saudi is there is now a renewable boom that is taking place. We have seen the first mega solar procurement which is out in the market, and in the second week of September we'll see the bids come in, and hopefully see the start of a new era on renewables for Saudi Arabia. Some very interesting targets have been set forward, almost 10 gigawatts to be precise, 9.5 gigawatts of renewables across wind, solar PV and CSP are getting procured in the next 6 years, in the next 5 years. The Saline Water Corporation is also going through its own privatization that is gonna mirror and follow very closely the pace at which we will see the Saudi Electric Genco privatization. On top of that, outside of the core assets of SWCC and Saudi Electric, we have opportunities like Ras Al Khair, which is a huge mega asset that is going to get privatized. In fact, it's probably the first one that's going to come online. at some stage there is a feeling when the construction is over for Yanbu 3, which is a mega power and water facility. It will also go on the block in terms of privatization. A number of large mega IWPs are coming up in the next 12 months. Yanbu, Jubail, all of them. We are just at the last mile of closing this year's probably only mega transaction, which is the Shoaiba RO expansion. It's a 250,000 cubic meter IWP. The first project in which we see the return of the Ministry of Finance guarantee, by the way, which was not there for the last 5-6 years, as the IPP and IWPP sector boomed and fueled itself in Saudi Arabia. So there is a lot to talk about Saudi Arabia in terms of opportunities, and I think the next 5 years and potentially even longer than that, Saudi Arabia is going to keep all of us pretty much occupied full time. Aramco is coming with its pet coke project, so you have technology players like GE, which will try to position itself for those kind of opportunities. Apart from Saudi Arabia, we will also see some mega transactions in Kuwait. Obviously, the only challenge with Kuwait remains is the track record between the issuance of the RFP and financial close has been a little bit longer than what we have seen in the rest of the GCC countries.
Sure.
But notwithstanding that, we still remain positive that Kuwait will continue to churn out a number of opportunities both in IWPPs and as also renewables. Oman has been a country that has consistently continued with its successful IPP program. There has been a bit of a delay in terms of the next one, which was Misfa 800 megawatt CCGT, but the coal ones coming in fast and thick, and in a couple of months they are issuing the pre-qualification for the renewables. They are going in for their first lot of PV procurement, similar to what Repdo in Saudi Arabia is doing with Sakaka. So we will see renewable opportunities in Oman coming up in parallel with coal and more gas-fired opportunities in the coming 2-3 years. DIVA will continue to follow the IPP route for most of its capacity expansion. They have already got a gigawatt of solar PV up there. The first 200 megawatts which went to ACWA Power, and the next 800 which went to the consortium of Masdar and EDF Renewables. The jury is still out in the context of CSP, but what is interesting is
ACWA Power is a low bidder for that one.
But what is interesting is that there is a lot of discussion about the size of the CSP being increased from what was being procured under the base proposal. So the 200 megawatts may not necessarily end up being 200 megawatts, simply because the last rounds of tariff bidding for the CSP, which is being procured as a base load, has demonstrated grid parity for CSP at 9.45 cents for the 200 megawatt. It is now clearly demonstrated that CSP with molten salt storage as a dispatchable power, as a baseload power, has reached grid parity. I think we will see the next phase of Hasian also coming up in Diva. FEWA is going to come out during the course of the next 2-3 months with its 1800 megawatt coal procurement. We will also see ADVIA being very active both on solar PV procurement, additional procurements, as also with some mega IWPs. They are busy right now getting their advisors sorted out before they issue fairly large substantive sizes of IWPs. So there is a lot to expect in the region, just the GCC primarily in the coming years.
A lot to look forward to, and obviously touched on the potential for the Saudi market. I actually interviewed Turki Al-Shiri, the head of Repto, a couple of days ago, so that interview will appear in MEED soon. So he was talking about the next rounds. They've got 300 PV solar out, 400 wind coming. They've got just over 1 gigawatt coming by first quarter next year out to the market. So exciting time. I mean, there's a lot more we could touch on, a lot more to discuss, but I think that's the time up for today. So I'd like to thank both our guests for what's been a very interesting discussion. Sasha Kline from GE, Rajat Nanda from ACWA Power.
Thank you.
And we look forward to you joining us in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.